In this next section, we're going to focus on analytics within vRealize Network Insights. So starting off with day two operations, obviously analytics are going to play an important factor in having visibility and troubleshooting within your infrastructure. Within vRealize Network Insight, there are many different types of analytics. We'll dive deeply into those. The analytic engine that vRealize Network Insight utilizes is very in-depth and sophisticated and generates a wealth of information. When you take a look at certain metrics, such as flow round trip time as an example, say we want to focus on TCP flow round trip time. We have that capability within vRealize Network Insight. So we can do analysis on flow round trip time. We can also take a look at all of the flows within our infrastructure and see where they actually become abnormal from their standard. And we also have the capability of adjusting that here on the percentage deviation and the absolute deviation. So this is showing me an overview of all the flows within my infrastructure and breaking them out by categories based off of the various milliseconds or seconds, letting me know how the flows are performing. I can simply click on one of these lines within the Sankey chart here, and it will actually show me the flows correlated to the number here. And then I can do diagnostics and see what's going on with the flows between the source and destination. We also can look at different things like latency metrics when it comes to, let's say we want to look for switch port metrics. So if I want to do like tap to tap or PNIC to PNIC and so on, or PNIC to VNIC, we have many different capabilities of doing also measurements of latency within vRealize Network Insight. Here is an example. We can see that we've chosen the option to look at PNIC to VNIC. This is specifically within a host. And I can see the VM, I can see the PNIC, the VNIC, and then I can see the PNIC to VNIC latency and also the max PNIC to VNIC latency. So as you can see, you can get a lot of different analytics when it comes to day two operations within vRealize Network Insight. Let's take a further look. One thing we can do is with the Dell switches that are also utilizing the BST, which is the Broadcom streaming telemetry feature within the chipsets inside their switches. We have the capability of also ingesting streaming telemetry for things like peak buffer utilization. So here we can see an alert that was generated for switch buffer threshold exceeded. Down here we can actually see the interface peak buffer utilization, and we can see when it has exceeded its buffer and started to actually drop packets on the transmit side. Now within the actual Dell switches running OS X, we can do a show running config telemetry, and here you can see how we've got the telemetry configured. So we set the telemetry destination group, and then we also need to make sure that we set the destination IP needs to be the same network insight collector that the OS X is configured using port 50,000. So when you add the actual Dell switches to vRealize Network Insight as a data source, whatever collector you choose, you need to make sure that the telemetry is set to send to that same collector. And then you also need to make sure that inside your configuration within your Dell OS X switch, that you do have that IP address set to send the telemetry to port 50,000. Within the flow analytics, this is where I was touching on the Sankey chart and the various different latencies. Here we can see where we can choose that we want to see all flows. We can look at intraflows, interflows, or all internet flows. And this is going to show us basically our TCP round trip time broken down by milliseconds or by seconds, depending on what we're seeing from a latency measurement. Network Insight will baseline the performance of the flows over a period of time, and if we start to see a deviation from the baseline of its standard performance when it comes to latency, we will mark those flows as abnormal. So I can see I have two flows that are abnormal between 1 to 15 milliseconds, and I've got 6 that are abnormal between 15 and 30 milliseconds. And that's not too bad from a latency perspective, but there's something going on that actually has caused those to increase latency. So if I wanted to look at these, I can click on example this line here for abnormal, and it would show me those 6 flows. Now here's an example of one of those flows. So let's say we had a high latency flow where we were seeing TCP round trip time between 120 and 480 milliseconds. Here we can actually see the source to the destination. This is giving us the IP address, the actual city, and then it's giving us the destination, and the virtual machine and the actual port that's being used within the specific flow. We're going to get detailed information on when this range of time occurred, what was the average TCP round trip time. This is going to be for the average for the selected variation, which we can see was at 440.4 milliseconds. How many data point counts did we have? We had 53. What was the TCP average round trip deviation in the 90th percentile, which was at 825.3 milliseconds? What was the average TCP round trip time percentage deviation in the 90th percentile? We can see that was at 187%. And then we can also see things like total traffic and what was the average traffic rate, along with details of the actual flow record. And if we wanted to add more metrics, we simply could just come over here and click add more filters and add things like packet drops. We can look at session counts and so on, depending on what we're looking to do with this specific exercise from a troubleshooting perspective. Now, when it comes to enabling the latency features within vRealize Network Insight, there's a couple different places this can be done. Latency can be enabled within the NSX-T data source, and it also is supported with the VMware SD-WAN edges. Now, within the NSX-T data source, when you come in and configure NSX-T, you'll choose your collector, and we've covered this on the installation section. So after we've configured our NSX-T data source, we enable our DFW, or distributed firewall IP fix flows, to send to the collector. And then you'll see a checkbox here where it says Enable Virtual Infrastructure Latency. By enabling this is going to allow us to see the additional latency features that we support, such as things like VTEP to VTEP. And it's going to provide detailed information in regards to making sure that you have the proper version of NSX-T, which requires 2.5 or newer. And then it's also going to want you to make sure that any firewall rule that you have in place or may need to be put in place is set to allow TCP traffic from all ESXi hosts to the Network Insight collector on port 1991. Then we can go ahead and hit submit, and we've now enabled the virtual infrastructure latency components. This is separate than our flow latency. Then when we come in, we can actually do search, and we can type in a host and either UCF-QDN or the specific IP address. And here's where we can actually come in and select what latency metrics we want to look at. We can do it network latency per PNIC as an example. We can do metrics of virtual machines and so on. Here we can see I'm looking at VTEP to VTEP latency. So this is showing me the VTEP host 1, VTEP host 2, and then I can see the VTEP and the VTEP 2. What is the VTEP to VTEP latency, and what is the max VTEP to VTEP latency? So this comes in handy when you're troubleshooting, especially your NSX-T infrastructure, when it comes to looking at like latency over across your TEPs. You also can find TEP latency reported on the NSX-T transport node dashboard. So once you go into the NSX-T transport node dashboard, down at the bottom where it says metrics, you can click on network latency details, and you're going to be able to see those same metrics, such as VTEP to VTEP latency. By hitting this drop down, you can look at things like VNIC to PNIC, PNIC to PNIC, and so on. Many different options that you'll find. Next, let's talk about traffic outliers. So outliers are actually defined as VMs behaving differently than others in a group. So within vRealize Network Insight, we have an outlier graph that lets you look at things around elephant flows, or you can do a custom analysis. You can choose your outliers. In this case, we chose VM, based on destination bytes and source bytes. Each one of these is representing an outlier. So each dot that we hover over will actually show us what is the source and destination for that actual outlier, and give us the total information of what we're looking at from the source bytes and the destination bytes. So we graph out the outliers so that you can click into these to see where you actually have VMs that are behaving differently than others within the group. So we can see here we have a group that are behaving very similar, and then we have our outliers. So we can dive in and take a look at those. Now within the analytic outlier detection, you can come in and you can also set doing some custom analysis. So in this case, you can come in and you can focus on detection of outliers in a given scope of VMs and IP addresses. Outlier analysis runs every 3 hours with 5-minute granularity. All of the flow data is used for analysis. Now, some of the use cases here are going to be for locating differences in network traffic behavior between similar virtual machines, let's say a group of web or database virtual machines. We can watch the amount of network traffic, session counts, etc. And we can also discover compromised VMs, which are going to be misconfigured load balancers or networking. So here we can have, under analytics, we have the option to choose outliers, thresholds, or flow insights. Here in this case, we would choose outliers, and then we can also come in and look at detailed outlier information based on different things that we choose within the outlier dashboard. Here you can see we're actually configuring outliers, and you can see here we set the outlier for port 443 on incoming traffic, and then you can also see the details of what we configured. Once this is configured, then you're going to start to see the analytics come in, and once it starts to reach within specific thresholds, you're going to be alerted within vRealize Network Insight, or be alerted via email, SNMP trap, or push notification, depending on what you have enabled for your outliers. Again, you can find outliers under the outlier section under analytics. We also can look into top talkers within vRealize Network Insight. So this is going to show us who is consuming what bandwidth. So here I can take a look and see top talkers by volume, rate, session count, and flow counts. We can also group by virtual machines, clusters, segments, security groups, and more. By changing the group by underneath the top talkers here, this is going to change the graph. So as you can see, here's where we can choose between various different things that we want to focus on. Then it's going to break out by flow volume, traffic rate, session count, and flow count from your top talker down. Hovering over this will give you detailed information around those flows for flow volume and traffic rate and so on, and the metrics. And then you can even click into it, look at the flow records for that specific flow and get all of the additional details. Now, with analytics within vRealize Network Insight, we have static analytics and we have dynamic thresholds. So from a proactive day 2 operation and troubleshooting perspective, some of the goals we have are to be able to proactively troubleshoot potential problems within a virtual infrastructure or application. This helps within network capacity planning for a virtual infrastructure or application. Now, some of the use cases are going to be around if any value for a set of objects exceeds or drops from a specific value. So let's look at some examples. If any virtual machine in an application scope has packet drop that is greater than 100 in a 30-minute interval, or if any VM in a cluster has traffic rate drops below 100 megabits per second in a 30-minute interval. Or we can say if flow rate in an application scope exceeds over 1 gigabits per second in an hour. Now we can also look at if a value for a set of objects deviates from the past behavior. So this is going to be an example of setting static thresholds. Dynamic thresholds allows us to use the stored information that we have based off of the normalized performance for each one of the objects within vRealize Network Insight. And then we can set a deviate from past behavior. So this allows us to set the deviation sensitivity between low, medium, and high. And then we can also use this to see if VMs within a scope have increased or decreased packet rate from the prior week, as an example, or if an application has higher or lower access rate from the prior week. There are many different use cases where static or dynamic thresholding comes into place. Further looking into this, we can also come in and do the configuration. So in this section here, you're going to see example of the configuration page for setting thresholds. So we'll want to come in and we're going to go ahead and select our scope. So here you can see I've selected flows. And then I came in and I choose between the available metrics. So I can see I can choose between network traffic rate, max rate, total network traffic, network packet count, packet drop, and network packet drop percentage. I can also come in and configure my sensitivity between high, medium, and low, the standard deviation, and then I can also say how long I want to use of the baseline data. So in this case, 7 days. I can also configure the violation notifications. So here I can set the criticality of the alert, the grouping, and I can also set things like SNMP traps, emails, or push notifications for each one of my thresholds that I've defined. Up top, the graph is going to show you the baseline for those, and it's going to show where you've breached those, either from a high point or from a low point. And then you also see within the list a list of all of the various flows or IPs or VMs, depending on what you selected for your scope, have actually breached that and how many times that has occurred. Now you can also come in within analytics under static and dynamic thresholds, and you can adjust things and detect changes based on fixed values. So this is going to be our static. So I can come in, I can give it a name, I can choose my scope, and then I can come in, and in this example, I choose virtual machines or name like Redmond. And you can see 3 entities were found. Now over here, I've got for metric, I've chosen network packet count aggregated over virtual machine when the total for any 30 minutes exceeds threshold, and I've set a static threshold of 1000 here. Now for dynamic thresholds, here's another example. I did VM threshold, virtual machine, same thing. And then here's where I set network traffic rate, aggregated over virtual machine, when the average for any 30 minutes interval deviates from past behavior. And then I choose between my sensitivity, high, medium, or low. So low requires 3 standard deviations, medium's 2.5, and high is going to be 2 standard deviations from the baseline. And then I can choose my alerting for my notifications.